Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful for You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Ridge Forrester had always believed that he had seen the worst of Sheila Carter, that the nightmares she created for him and the people he loved had already reached the kind of monstrous peak that no human being, no matter how unstable or desperate, could ever surpass. But on the day he was supposed to stand beside Taylor Hayes and watch her step into a new chapter of her life, that illusion shattered in a way so violent, so abrupt, and so emotionally catastrophic that it would mark the Forrester family forever, and the events of that day unfolded with the kind of surreal intensity that made everyone who witnessed it wonder later if they had somehow stepped into a different reality, one where love, hope, joy, and celebration could be flipped into terror in the span of mere seconds. Because the wedding venue, an elegant outdoor courtyard designed to reflect everything Taylor represented, peace, renewal, forgiveness, and the belief that good still existed in the world, stood drenched in sunlight, decorated with soft white roses and pale blue hydrangeas, and filled with loved ones who genuinely believed that after everything Taylor had endured, from heartbreaks to betrayals to tragedies that could break even the strongest soul, she finally deserved this moment of unfiltered happiness. But lurking beneath that beauty was a storm no one saw coming, and Sheila, the eternal shadow haunting the Forrester world, waited in a place only she understood, driven by motives so twisted and layered that even she might not have been able to articulate them clearly, though deep down everyone would eventually learn that Sheila had convinced herself that this wedding represented a final erasure of her, a symbolic declaration that the Forresters had won and she had lost, and Sheila Carter was not a woman who accepted loss. Not in life, not in love, not in any part of her chaotic existence. As guests settled into their seats, with Steffi and Thomas exchanging relieved glances, Hayes babbling happily in Finn's arms, and Brooke quietly admitting to Hope that even she had to acknowledge that Taylor had earned this moment, the air felt thick with something indescribable, a quiet tension lingering beneath the smiles, and Ridge, standing near the aisle adjusting his tie, kept feeling a strange pull in his chest, as if the universe were trying to warn him that joy inside his family never arrived without a price, but he pushed it aside because he wanted to believe Taylor could finally have something beautiful and untouched. Yet the moment Taylor stepped forward in her gown, simple, elegant, shimmering slightly in the sun, everything changed, because Sheila emerged from behind the far row of hedges with the abruptness of a nightmare slicing into a dream, her eyes wild, her hands shaking, her voice cracking as she shouted Taylor's name with a desperation that made the entire wedding party freeze in place. No one moved at first, a kind of collective paralysis overtook the crowd as they tried to understand whether the moment unfolding was real or some kind of hallucination fueled by years of fear. But Sheila was real, painfully real, and she moved with the energy of a cornered animal, charging forward with something clutched in her hand, a glint of metal catching the sunlight. And Ridge reacted before he even understood what he was reacting to, screaming Taylor's name as he lunged forward. But chaos erupts faster than human instinct, and within seconds the peaceful wedding turned into a panicked blur of screams, overturned chairs, and rushing footsteps, and Sheila, driven by a level of obsession that defied logic, reached Taylor with a sobbing, fractured sentence. "You took everything from me." Before the attack exploded into reality, Taylor stumbled back. Shock etched across her face as the metallic object Sheila swung connected with her shoulder, sending her crashing to the ground as Finn grabbed Sheila from behind. Steffi screamed, and Ridge fell to his knees beside Taylor, whose breathing had already grown shallow as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The world seemed to collapse around Ridge in those seconds, every memory, every regret, every unspoken apology, every moment he had failed her or doubted her flashing through him like snapshots of a life he feared he was losing all over again, because seeing Taylor hurt triggered the deepest wound inside him, the one he had never fully healed from. And as paramedics rushed in, thanks to Carter, who had sprinted to call 911 the second Sheila appeared, Ridge held Taylor's trembling hand, whispering to her in a voice so broken that even Brooke, standing a few feet away, felt a sudden ache in her chest. Because Ridge Forrester was not a man who broke easily, yet watching him beg Taylor to stay awake revealed a vulnerability that silenced everyone. Meanwhile, Sheila, pinned to the grass by Finn and two security guards, continued shouting through gasps and tears that she hadn't meant to hurt her that much, a phrase so disturbingly delusional that Steffi almost collapsed from the emotional weight of it, and Finn, torn between fury and responsibility, could barely look at his mother without feeling a sickness twist inside his stomach. The ambulance doors slammed shut as Taylor was rushed toward the hospital, and Ridge, refusing to let go of her hand until the paramedics forced him to step back, watched the vehicle speed away with a haunted expression that made even the strongest members of the Forrester family feel the tremor of impending tragedy, because none of them knew if Taylor would survive the attack. None of them knew whether this moment, which should have been a celebration, would instead become a permanent source of grief, and none of them knew how deeply Ridge's soul had fractured in those few violent seconds. The hours at the hospital passed like a suspended nightmare, the kind where time moved just enough to torture you but not enough to bring clarity, and Ridge paced the hallway with the frantic energy of a man replaying every mistake he had ever made with Taylor, every time he had walked away, every time he had chosen Brooke instead, every moment he had taken for granted, and with each thought he felt himself slipping further into a darkness he hadn't known existed, while Steffi and Thomas sat silently nearby, both visibly shaken but trying to remain strong, and Finn, standing beside them, kept staring at his hands as if he could still feel the weight of Sheila's body beneath them, because for the first time in his life he had physically stopped his mother from taking a life, and the realization of that shattered something inside him that he couldn't articulate. Brooke arrived later, quietly approaching Ridge not with the territorial tension that had defined so much of their past but with genuine compassion, placing a hand on his shoulder simply to let him know he wasn't alone, and he collapsed into her briefly, not in love, not in longing, but in raw, human anguish, before pulling away and telling her that if Taylor didn't survive, he would never forgive himself, words that made Brooke's heart clench with a sorrow that felt almost unbearable. Hours later, when the surgeon finally emerged, the entire hallway fell silent, and Ridge stepped forward with a look of desperate hope, but the surgeon's expression was grim, though not hopeless, and he explained that Taylor had suffered a severe trauma, one that required emergency intervention, and though she was alive, she wasn't out of danger, a phrase that made Ridge go pale as he whispered a silent prayer, something he hadn't done in years. The next hours were a blur of waiting, worrying, and silently pleading with the universe to spare the woman who had given her entire life to healing others, and when they were finally allowed to see her, Ridge entered the ICU with a heaviness that shook his entire body, but seeing Taylor lying there, pale, bandaged, her breath shallow but steady, ignited something fierce inside him, a determination not to lose her again, a promise to stand by her the way she had always stood by him, and he took her hand, pressed it against his forehead, and whispered that he loved her, that he needed her, that he couldn't imagine a world without her warmth or her kindness or her strength. Meanwhile, across the city, Sheila sat in custody, her wrists cuffed, her hair tangled, her face streaked with dried tears, still insisting she only wanted to talk, a delusion so profound that even the officers escorting her shook their heads in disbelief. And as news of the attack spread, the Forrester world braced for impact, media scrutiny, legal battles, emotional fallout, and the reality that nothing would ever be the same. Back in the hospital, Ridge remained by Taylor's side through the night, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing to allow his eyes to drift away from her chest rising and falling, and as the first hint of morning light filtered through the blinds, Taylor stirred, weakly, painfully, but unmistakably, and Ridge gasped as her fingers twitched around his, her eyes fluttering open just enough to see him. And in that fragile, whispered moment she asked, "Ridge, am I safe?" And the sheer innocence of the question broke him completely, because he realized then that her first thought upon returning to consciousness wasn't about pain or fear or even Sheila, it was about whether he was there, whether the world around her had stopped spinning long enough for her to feel protected. Choking on emotion, Ridge leaned forward and told her, "I've got you, Doc. I'm right here," and as tears slid down his face, Taylor reached up, barely, weakly, and touched his cheek, a gesture filled with decades of history, forgiveness, and unspoken love. Outside the room, Steffi and Thomas watched the scene with tears in their eyes, knowing their mother's journey toward healing was only beginning, and knowing Sheila's attack would alter every path the family walked from here on out. Yet in that small, quiet ICU room, there was a flicker of hope, the kind that survives even the darkest storms, and Ridge, for the first time in years, understood with absolute clarity that he couldn't waste another second, couldn't run from his feelings, couldn't allow fear or confusion or guilt to dictate his life anymore, because nearly losing Taylor had reminded him of the truth he'd buried beneath years of complicated choices. She was the steady heartbeat in his world, the woman who had believed in him long before he learned to believe in himself, and though he didn't know what the future held, legal battles, emotional breakdowns, security concerns, and the terrifying reality that Sheila could still manipulate the narrative, he knew one thing with complete certainty: he would protect Taylor Hayes, not just from Sheila Carter but from the years of emotional turmoil he had put her through. And as he sat beside her, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of sleep, Ridge silently vowed that this attack, this nightmare, would not be the end of their story. It would be the moment he began fighting for her the way she had always fought for him. And as the hours unfolded inside that dimly lit ICU room, where the rhythmic beeping of machines felt like the fragile heartbeat of hope itself, Ridge refused to leave Taylor's side even for a moment, sitting so close that he could hear every shaky inhale she made and watching over her with a devotion that surprised even him, because the attack had stripped away every wall he had carefully built over the years, every excuse he had used to distance himself from her, and what remained was the raw truth that he had spent far too long running from. Taylor was the anchor of his life, the one constant in the chaos of his choices, and losing her, truly losing her, would destroy him in ways he couldn't articulate. Meanwhile, outside the safety of her hospital room, the rest of the Forrester family spiraled in their own ways, with Steffi pacing the hallway like a caged storm, her mind replaying the attack in jagged loops while she blamed herself for ever believing Sheila could be contained, and Thomas staring blankly at the floor, feeling that familiar guilt weigh on him because whenever disaster struck their family, he always felt responsible in some twisted way, as if the universe kept demanding penance from him. Finn, standing apart from the siblings, was drowning in a tidal wave of conflicting grief and responsibility, because he had physically tackled his own biological mother to stop her from killing Taylor, and though logically he understood he had done the right thing, emotionally he felt as though he had crossed some invisible line that could never be uncrossed, and he wondered if a part of Sheila, twisted, manipulative, monstrous, would always haunt his shadow. Brooke, who had stayed longer than she initially intended, felt a quiet ache settle in her chest as she watched Ridge through the ICU window, the way his hand never left Taylor's, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, and she realized with painful clarity that something had shifted. Something profound and irreversible. Because this wasn't just Ridge comforting a friend or a co-parent, this was a man who had just come face to face with the possibility of losing the woman who knew him better than anyone. But even as emotions brewed among the Forresters, across town Sheila sat in a holding cell, her mind unraveling in a haze of fractured logic and obsessive justification, muttering to herself that she had been pushed, cornered, erased, that the Forresters had forced her hand, that Taylor had taken everything, that Finn had betrayed her. And the officers monitoring her exchanged uneasy glances because there was an eerie clarity in her delusions, a terrifying confidence that hinted she didn't see herself as a criminal, she saw herself as a victim of a world conspiring against her. Back at the hospital, morning shifted into afternoon, sunlight warming the hallway floors as more friends and family appeared, Carter, Katie, even Eric, who arrived with Donna's help. Emotionally shaken and physically weakened but determined to be there because Taylor had saved his life before, and he would never forget it, and when Eric saw Ridge, he placed a trembling hand on his son's shoulder, offering silent support, but Ridge barely nodded, his focus still locked entirely on the unconscious woman in the bed. And hours later, when Taylor's eyes fluttered open again, Ridge leaned in so quickly he nearly knocked over the chair, whispering that she wasn't alone, that the family was here, that she was loved beyond measure. Taylor, confused and disoriented, struggled to piece together the shattered fragments of memory, flowers, sunlight, a walkway, then chaos, and when she finally whispered, "Sheila," she was there. The small tremor in her voice sent a wave of anger and protectiveness surging through Ridge, who gently stroked her hand and told her not to worry, that Sheila was in custody, that she couldn't hurt her again, but Taylor shook her head weakly, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes as she whispered, "She always finds a way." Ridge, what if this isn't over? And the fear in her voice cut him deeper than any injury could. Meanwhile, Steffi couldn't hold back her emotions any longer and rushed into the room, immediately dropping to her knees beside her mother's bed, grasping her hand, apologizing through tears for not keeping her safe. But Taylor, even in her fragile state, reached weakly toward her daughter and told her she had nothing to apologize for, that Sheila's madness was never their burden to carry, though. The weight of it always seemed to fall on them anyway. After a while, when Taylor drifted back to sleep, Steffi left the room, wiping her eyes and whispering to Finn that they had to do something, anything, to finally end Sheila's reign of terror, and Finn, torn between the moral boundaries of medicine and the primal instinct to protect his family, simply nodded, because he knew something had to change, and soon. Hours passed with Ridge never once looking away from Taylor for more than a breath. And as night settled again, he stood, leaning over her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and whispered a confession he had been holding for years, admitting that he had taken her love for granted, that he had run from his feelings out of fear and confusion, that he had let circumstances and history dictate his choices, but almost losing her had shattered every excuse he'd ever made, and he wasn't going to waste another second of his life pretending he didn't love her, and though Taylor was unconscious, a tear slipped from the corner of her eye, as if her heart heard the words even if her mind was drifting. Outside the room, Brooke stood silently, overhearing just enough to understand that Ridge was slipping into a place she couldn't follow, and though the realization stung deeply, she closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer for Taylor's recovery, because despite decades of rivalry, she didn't want this, didn't want violence, fear, or terror to define their lives. And she stepped away, choosing grace over conflict for perhaps the first time in years. Meanwhile, law enforcement prepared formal charges against Sheila: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, violation of parole, breaking multiple restraining orders, and even though everyone believed this could finally be the end of her, there was an unspoken awareness in the air. Sheila Carter had escaped justice before, manipulated systems before, and twisted her way out of impossible situations more times than anyone could count, and the possibility that she might do it again lingered like a venomous shadow over the Forresters. As dawn approached once more, Ridge pulled a blanket over his shoulders and rested his head beside Taylor's hand, his exhaustion heavy but his determination stronger, and in that quiet moment, as the hospital hummed with the distant sounds of nurses preparing for the morning shift, Ridge made a silent vow to himself, to Taylor, to his family, that no matter what Sheila tried next, no matter what danger lingered beneath the surface, he wouldn't let fear dictate their lives anymore, and he wouldn't let Taylor face the aftermath of this alone, because this wasn't just about surviving Sheila's attack, it was about reclaiming the future she had nearly stolen. And as the sun rose over Los Angeles, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Ridge whispered one final promise into the stillness of the room: "This time, I'm not letting go." And as the new day stretched across the hospital corridors, Ridge found himself trapped in a loop of exhaustion, adrenaline, fear, and aching devotion, unable to pull himself away from Taylor even as his eyes burned and his body begged for rest, because the thought of her waking up alone terrified him in a way he hadn't felt since the day he learned she'd been presumed dead in Monaco, and he couldn't shake the image of her lying on that wedding aisle, pale, wounded, bleeding, while chaos exploded around them. The memory replayed like a cinematic nightmare every time he blinked, and he hated himself for not having sensed Sheila sooner, not having protected Taylor with the instinct he usually carried so fiercely, and those thoughts spiraled deeper as hours passed, especially when a nurse gently suggested he take a break and he snapped back with a rawness he didn't intend, because stepping away felt too much like abandoning her, too much like repeating the mistakes that haunted him for years. Meanwhile, Steffi returned with fresh clothes for him, speaking softly as she urged him to shower, eat, breathe, just for a moment, but Ridge shook his head, his jaw trembling with the effort to keep himself composed as he insisted he couldn't leave, not when Taylor needed him, not when he still felt the echo of her fingers twitch in his own as she fought to stay conscious the night before. Steffi exchanged a worried glance with Finn, who stood nearby like a man carrying a mountain on his back. Because even though he was used to life-or-death situations, the emotional devastation left in Sheila's wake was unlike anything he could treat with medicine. This was trauma that seeped into the bones of everyone she touched, twisting families into new shapes and leaving scars that might never fully heal. Thomas, who had been doing everything he could to keep his darker impulses controlled, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned ghostly white, whispering to Finn that if Sheila ever came near their mother again, he didn't care about consequences or laws or the moral high ground, he would end her once and for all. And Finn didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because the quiet turmoil inside him was too heavy, the conflict between his oath as a doctor and his hatred for Sheila grinding against each other until he felt he might split in two, and all the while, back in her holding cell, Sheila's mind churned with a disturbing stillness, the type that suggested calculation rather than remorse, and she sat on the small metal bench whispering to herself about how this wasn't supposed to happen, how she only wanted Finn to understand, how the Forresters had pushed her, cornered her, painted her as a monster when all she wanted was a place in her son's life, and her delusions hardened into something sharper, something dangerous, as she convinced herself that the attack hadn't been an act of violence, it had been a plea, a desperate attempt to be heard, and the fact that it ended with her locked in a cell only strengthened her belief that she was the true victim, not Taylor, not Ridge, not anyone else suffering from the trauma she had caused. Later that afternoon, as Ridge continued his vigil beside Taylor, a soft knock echoed from the doorway and Eric entered with Donna steadying him, his frail form trembling slightly as he approached the bed, and when he looked at Taylor, his eyes filled with tears, not just because he cared for her, but because he felt a haunting guilt that bad things kept happening to the people he loved while he, once the strong patriarch, now felt too weak to shield them. Ridge stood, embracing his father tightly, and for a moment the two men simply held on to each other, grieving not only the attack but the years of chaos that had led them to this moment. And Eric whispered brokenly that the Forrester family had been living under Sheila's shadow for far too long, that he feared the cost this time might be too high, and Ridge swallowed hard, unable to disagree. Evening crept in once more.